Coming up on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Elena Pinto this week, the race to become the 25th state to legalize cannabis could be coming to an end as the House of Representatives in Pennsylvania passes a bill to create a state-run dispensary system to sell to adults. Now it's on to the Senate while their governor is poised to sign when it gets to his desk. We'll have reaction.
And we don't believe this current bill, the way it's constructed, will make it through the Senate. We don't really understand how a state-sponsored cannabis program would actually even work.
For decades, the University of Mississippi has been the only school allowed to study cannabis potency, but now the Department of Government Efficiency is pulling the plug on that program in order to save millions of dollars earmarked for cannabis research. Meanwhile, the U.S. Supreme Court refuses to hear a case from a Mississippi business challenging the ban on advertising in that state. And Ohio passes a law moving the intoxicating hemp products from gas stations and convenience stores to legal dispensaries for sale. And after 52 years, the New York Cannabis Parade has officially been canceled. All that and state cannabis reports from coast to coast on Cannabis Coast to Coast News with Elena Pinto next.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Elena Pinto. This is PCM TV's weekly roundup of cannabis news as we continue to document the fight to end cannabis prohibition at the federal level. We've been documenting that fight for the past 4 years, and you can check that out by downloading the PCM TV app. All you have to do is scan the QR code, and it will take you to the App Store or Google Play. It's free to download. With the app, you can get every week's show on demand on your phone. In the meantime, the 23rd state to legalize adult use of cannabis is ready to start issuing licenses for growing and manufacturing. The state of Minnesota is finally ready to hold their licensing lottery in the first week in June, with licenses being awarded at that time. The industry has been waiting for this for a few years now, and opening a new state market couldn't come at a better time for the industry that continues to struggle with overregulation and unfair taxation. The state that seems poised to be the 25th adult use legal state is Pennsylvania. Their governor, Josh Shapiro, has made it clear he wants to see an adult use market start this year. That state's House of Representatives passed a bill this past week, paving the way for state-run cannabis dispensaries. In an extremely tight vote of 102 to 101, it makes the Cannabis Health and Safety Act a reality, and now that bill moves on to the Senate. This bill also will clear the records of past offenders who were victims of the failed war on drugs. Friend of PCM TV and former Pennsylvania correspondent Claudia Post talked with executive producer Jimmy Young about the chances of this bill getting through the state Senate there.
Let me say this. I'll start off by saying this is political theater. And according to many of the folks that I've spoken with, this is just politics because the state store model is an absurd model. We are the laughingstock of the country. And the reason is because where else except New Hampshire, the tiny little state of New Hampshire, has a state store model? Why is that a state that we want to emulate? Why, I ask people, when we have a whole bunch of other states, we have a smorgasbord of opportunity to look at, study, and pick the best of what's out there. Instead, we're swimming upstream. It's just stupid. And according to folks on the inside, this is not going to be the bill.
Jimmy was able to connect with another person who has a direct connection with the Keystone State. It's Gibran Washington, the CEO of Ethos, a medical dispensary based in Pennsylvania, for his reaction.
Okay, Elena, thank you so much. And we are so proud to have a member of the Pennsylvania cannabis community in with us on Cannabis Coast to Coast News this week. His name is Gibran Washington. He's a very successful entrepreneur from Pennsylvania, but it's via Florida, right? Because Florida is your home state, correct?
And
Florida's home state, but I have a home in Philadelphia, so Pennsylvania is home. I pay taxes in Pennsylvania.
Oh, there you go. Well, there you go. And good for you for paying your taxes, by the way. Because in this industry, a lot of people don't like to pay bills, whether it's taxes or not. Anyway, let's keep going. So, big news this week in Pennsylvania: the House of Representatives passes a bill for adult use, 102 to 101, bipartisan lines, was Republicans 101 and Democrats 102. Let's not get into politics if we can help it. Here's my number one question for you. Is this the beginning, or is there another bill in the legislature that may have a better chance to survive what will be, I'm sure, amendments in the Senate?
Yeah, I mean, I think Amend Brown has a really good bill. It's very similar to what Senator Street has over in the Senate that we are behind, and similar bills of such. And we don't believe this current bill, the way it's constructed, will make it through the Senate. We don't really understand how a state-sponsored cannabis program would actually even work. If we want to just kind of talk to the mechanics of how they would even be able to accept money, how employees would be able to do these kind of transactions. So as long as it's federally illegal, we really don't understand how the state of Pennsylvania will be able to execute this, but we also don't feel that's an equitable approach to giving people access to cannabis, whether that's from the patient side or from the business side. Because if you go to a state-run model, people who have been disproportionately impacted with the war on drugs won't have an opportunity to have a seat at the table as an ownership seat at the table, and that's something that I think we all want as we talk about the history and the culture of cannabis.
Absolutely. And you guys have 8 locations in Pennsylvania right now. They're obviously all medical because that is the only thing that's allowed in Pennsylvania. It must help to have a governor like Josh Shapiro who backs this effort and wants to sign a bill for adult use in his state. I'm not quite sure, based on everything that I'm hearing and reading about this, that it may be the right bill, but it's certainly I've pegged Pennsylvania as the 25th state to become an adult use legal. So I hope they don't let me down. The Eagles didn't let me down, so I'm hoping that they don't let me down in the legislative chambers, as it were. Is this the year that it's going to happen?
It's the year we would hope for it to happen. I think Governor Shapiro has shown that he's an amazing common sense governor. He does what's right for the people of Pennsylvania, and we've been wanting this to happen for several years now. We feel this is a good inflection point. I think there's a lot of states that have gone from medical into the recreational space, and they've seen positive impacts, whether that's from revenue, whether that's from overall health in their municipality. So we believe that this is the right time. Last year was the right time. So whenever they feel as though they're ready to accept cannabis as a medicinal medicine for more and more Pennsylvanians, we think it's the time is always now.
Since 1968, the University of Mississippi has been the only federally approved college to grow and study cannabis. That program has now fallen victim to President Trump's executive orders to make the government more efficient, thus ending research programs deemed unnecessary. For years, whenever the DEA made a bust or states confiscated illegally grown cannabis, they would send it to the university to study its potency in cannabinoid makeup. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency made the announcement on May 1st that said, quote, "In the last 2 days, agencies terminated 148 wasteful contracts with a ceiling value of $420 million and savings of $198 million, including a $143,000 HHS contract for the potency monitoring of confiscated marijuana samples." End quote. One more note from Mississippi: a business in that state is suing regulators over their ban on advertising. This case made it all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States, but they have refused to even take a look at that since they believe this is a state issue not protected by free speech as mentioned in the Constitution. Now let's start our state reports with Karen Black in Arizona.
I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Workers at True Leaves Magnolia Cultivation Facility in Phoenix, the notoriously skunky smelling one near Sky Harbor Airport, have ratified Arizona's first ever union contract for cannabis cultivation. The historic 4-year deal with UFCW Local 99 includes guaranteed wage increases, paid holidays and time off, and seniority-based promotions. This milestone follows the January 2024 union vote and marks a major step forward for cannabis workers in the state's growing industry. It's also only the second union agreement for Arizona's agricultural workers since 1993. On the legislative front, the Cannabis Advertising Restrictions Bill has been sent to the governor for signature. The final measure is very different from the original text and seems to have found a sweet spot between keeping kids safe and letting businesses do their thing. Governor Hobbs is expected to sign the bill, but if she doesn't, it can still become law with a 2/3 majority legislature vote. There's been no movement on the other two measures, rural opportunity licenses and releasing funds for medical research, so they're likely dead until next session. Speaking of research, a study by Arizona State University found cannabis-related hospital visits in the Grand Canyon state jumped 20% between 2016 and 2021, with a growing number linked to mental health issues like depression and psychosis. Older adults saw the steepest increase. Researchers warn today's more potent cannabis could be driving the trend. Legalization was not a factor since the spike started before adult use sales began. Here's an update to a story we've been following. Arizona's hemp industry is asking the Court of Appeals to step in after a judge refused to block the state from cracking down on sales of hemp-based THC products outside licensed dispensaries. The Hemp Industry Trade Association argues these sales are federally legal, but Attorney General Chris Mays disagrees. The appellate court is now reviewing whether to intervene while enforcement continues. A lower court hearing could resume if the request is denied. And lastly, the Mint Cannabis, based in Guadalupe, Arizona, recently opened its 7th retail location, this one in El Mirage. That's all for this week's Arizona Report. I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
There's a new vape player expanding into Washington state. Row Vapes has operations in multiple states as they continue to grow their market presence in the vape category, and now they're moving into the Great Northwest. With more from Washington State, here's Matthew Friedlander.
Hey, I'm Matthew Friedlander with Skagit Organics, coming to you with the Washington State Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast. So today I'm reporting from the 10th annual Washington Cannabis Summit hosted by the Cannabis Alliance, Washington's largest and most effective cannabis trade. Our theme this year was 10 years rooted in integrity. And so today we had a full days-long conversation about the history of cannabis, not only here in Washington, but around the world. And we talked a lot about what the future of cannabis looks like here in Washington State. I've talked in the past about Washington having some of the most restrictive residency requirements for ownership of a license here in Washington, which makes this next bit of news a little bit surprising. We've had a new and expanding MSO expanded to Washington, Row Vapes. And this is not something that we hear about a lot in Washington because, again, of the ownership requirements that you have to live here in Washington and to own a cannabis license. So we don't see a lot of outside investment from these larger companies. So it'll be interesting to see how this fares for this company. We welcome to the I-502 industry here in Washington. And that is what I've got for you today out of Washington. I'm Matthew reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.
There's some good news coming out of one of the smallest cannabis markets in the U.S., out of Vermont. Regulators there recognize that their original medical program is floundering. So starting July 1st, they will allow all adult use dispensaries to start selling tax-free medical products once approved by the Vermont Cannabis Control Board. The next up is Virginia, where that governor's race is starting to heat up between the two female candidates to replace the controversial incumbent Glenn the Veto Man, Youngkin, whose term ends this year. Here's Joe Parsons with more from the Cavalier State.
I'm Joe Parsons with the Virginia Cannabis Connection by Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WB, and reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. With little surprise, Governor Glenn Youngkin has vetoed yet another cannabis bill that not only passed the legislature, but had strong support in both chambers. HB 1989 would have allowed for an update to product labeling requirements that would have made more clearly the THC and CBD levels. It would have also allowed for medical cannabis deliveries to be at other locations other than the patient's primary residence. This was important for patient access, and with limited delivery windows from the limited number of stores here in the Commonwealth, it would have made the medical program a more reliable and safe option in compared to using the legacy market that still reigns supreme in Virginia. In the governor's veto message, he said, "While accurate labeling is essential to ensure patients receive consistent and safe medical cannabis, this bill would codify the ability to deliver cannabis to commercial businesses and temporary residencies, raising public safety and regulatory concerns." Like all of his vetoes that would advance any portion of Virginia's cannabis programs, his stance for the industry remains the same. And let's be honest, who didn't see this one coming? Here's a not-so-fun fact. Governor Glenn Youngkin has now broken a record. That's right, he broke the Commonwealth's record for the most vetoes in a single year and the absolute most for any governor in his entire term. So, congratulations, I guess. What is worse is that he's done nothing to advance the industry in a positive way during his entire term, something which he campaigned to not do. He said not only would he uphold the current medical market, but he promised to help start and regulate an adult use market. Instead, he's vetoed almost every piece of reform legislation that has crossed his desk. Now it'll be up to the upcoming historical election to decide the future of cannabis in Virginia. So, that's going to do it for this week. From Higher Education's Coffee Talk, sponsored by 97.5 3WB in Charlottesville, and as always, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Joe Parsons. Until next time, stay lifted.
In Maryland, their governor, Wes Moore, has been proactive with his support of the reform of cannabis laws. In 2024, his expungement of 170,000 criminal cannabis records is one of his most proud accomplishments. And this year, in April, Governor Moore signed a law that exempts employee stock ownership plans from the state's 5-year licensing hold requirements. While that was designed to encourage more employee ownership in the industry, it also opened the door to allow businesses to bypass the dreaded 280E tax code that bans cannabis businesses from writing off regular business expenses that every other industry enjoys in order to stay in business. Christopher Bright has more from Maryland.
I'm Christopher Bright from The Enlightened Voice. Welcome to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'll be bringing you the latest cannabis headlines from Maryland. Maryland's cannabis industry just got a game changer. Governor Wes Moore signed a law exempting employee stock ownership plans, or ESOPs, from the state's 5-year license hold rule. This opens up an exit strategy for cannabis business owners and lets the companies sidestep hefty taxes under Section 280E. ESOPs lets owners sell stock to a trust for employees, deferring capital gains taxes. Massachusetts companies like Theory Wellness and The Vault have been doing this since 2023. Darren of MBO Ventures says this is a smart way to sell to employees and not just private equity. Beyond tax breaks, ESOPs boost worker dedication. Canna Provisions' Meg Sanders says employees now watch every penny, knowing profits hit their pockets. The Vault's Michael add that their ESOP turned their staff into owners focused on success. But ESOPs aren't for all. Attorney Hannah King says you need at least 25 employees and $2 million in earnings. Still, it's a win for founders and teams in the tough market. And for a short mention, I would like to talk about Senator Also Brooks, who has called for the resignation of RFK out of office with the HAS. And this has been the Maryland Cannabis Report for this week. I'm Christopher Bright from The Enlightened Voice, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
That'll do it for the A Block this week, but don't go anywhere. We have another handful of stories from the U.S. before we head to Canada to hear from Debbie Facey on the impact of their transitional government on the legal cannabis industry in that country. And Ben Stevens has a report on Denmark's new medical program. That's our international segment coming up next on Cannabis Coast to Coast News. It all continues after this break.
We focus solely on the cannabis space. The cannabis is not just another item that we've put on our website and said, oh, we're in cannabis. We do cannabis and cannabis only, and we focus on cannabis day in and day out. So with Buds Group, we're going to not only work with you and give you advice, we're going to help see your project through to completion. And you're going to find at the end of the day, it'll be a fraction of a cost of working with a larger firm, because our executives are focused just on cannabis and we run lean.
Welcome back to Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Elena Pinto. Canada has a new prime minister with Mark Carney replacing Pierre Trudeau, and he inherits a mess in the cannabis business. The country that Canada has been successfully exporting their cannabis to is Israel. That Middle East country has now placed a tariff of 165% on those imports, which could be devastating to both countries. In the meantime, there's a company called Ghost Drops that Health Canada has fined twice for advertising violations. The Haunting of Hexwood is all ages event in Canada, and Ghost Drops was a sponsor. The Cannabis Act of Canada prohibits messaging to under 21-year-olds, and that country's regulatory board believes their sponsorship at that event was in violation and issued the fines. And now, with a new prime minister in place, Canadians are concerned about what changes Mark Carney might make to their federally legal industry. In our international reports, we start with our Canadian correspondent, Debbie Facey, on the impact of her country's leadership change.
This is Debbie Facey with the Canadian Cannabis Coast to Coast News Report. So what we have in Canada this week, which is a big thing, which is our new legislation and our new prime minister. With our new prime minister coming into play, we are hoping for a better way for us to actually create a more reform and more unison way for the cannabis industry to be more successful. With the overall $43 billion that we have been able to contribute to the GDP, and having successfully hired 80,000 people within the sector, we are still finding that normalizing the actual laws and regulations has been a hurdle, and we are hoping for that to become a little bit easier. In Nelson, BC, they are actually proposing to opening up patios, which is something that needs to happen, especially here in Ontario, due to the fact that with most of our safe injection sites, they have been closed, and more people are trying to find safer ways to be able to consume within a larger group of people, especially their buds. So, as I conclude our amazing segment for Canada this week, is overall we are hoping for new legislations, better normalization, better cultivation innovations, as well as just laws that are unison within all of Canada when it comes to cannabis. This is Debbie Facey with the Canadian Coast to Coast Cannabis News Report. Peace.
I'm Ben Stevens, the editor of Business of Cannabis, with this week's news from Europe for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Denmark has officially passed legislation which will solidify its long-running medical cannabis pilot program as a permanent fixture in its national healthcare system, in what has been dubbed a victory for patients. However, it's not such a victory for the Danish cannabis operators. So the country has offered numerous tightly restricted forms of access to medical cannabis for a few years, including a pilot scheme since 2018, which has enabled thousands to access medical cannabis treatment. Last November, the government announced plans to make this permanent, and this week the government officially placed this into law, and the generalised scheme is set to go to effect on January 1st, 2026. The catch for Danish operators currently providing products to this pilot scheme is that despite a lengthy consultation process, the government has all but copy and pasted the framework from the pilot scheme into the permanent one, which comes with some really major flaws. Another of the 4 access routes previously mentioned alongside the pilot scheme is magistral products. Now, these are custom-made formulations by licensed pharmacies to meet individual patient needs where no other alternative is available. This is where it gets fairly interesting. So there's only one pharmacy in Denmark licensed to create these formulations. It has very, very little regulation, certainly compared to the pilot scheme operators. And it basically means that this one pharmacy can create rival formulations, all but matching the ones these companies have spent years and millions getting approved. The kicker is that for still unexplained reasons, the government provides an 85% reimbursement for patients accessing these magistral formulations. This compares to around 50% for pilot scheme products. But, on average, it's about 37% from what I've read. This means that the single pharmacy dominates around 50% of the market, leaving the other companies to compete for the rest. Not to mention that they are able to charge about 5 times as much for the same products, but patients still flock to the magistral pharmacy because the 85% subsidy means it's still cheaper. While there's still other problems, the lack of action on this major imbalance has companies worried. They now hope that the Ministry of Health, which has been granted full authority to make changes as they see fit, will take action before January the 1st and the scheme launches. That's all for this week. I'm Ben Stevens with Business of Cannabis, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
The world of hemp continues to grow, and while many states are still trying to ban it rather than regulate it, we recognize that hemp is here to stay. And now, with a trend of multi-state operators already investing in the hemp space with infused beverages and Curaleaf closing its licensed medical dispensary in Florida to open a hemp store, we enlisted a guy who has been part of the hemp industry for years. His name is Kerry Hinkle, and here's this week's hemp report.
This is Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp out of Houston, Texas, and this is your hemp report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This week, May 5th, we saw the end of a long debate in the Alabama legislature on how to regulate hemp products. And their answer? Just let alcohol do it. Starting next year, the Alabama Alcoholic Beverage Control Board will begin to regulate how hemp products are made, where they can be sold, and how much THC is going to be allowed in them. Their intent here is to allow for licensed package stores, licensed hemp retailers, pharmacies can sell some products, and grocery stores that sell beer and wine can sell these intoxicating hemp beverages right next to those products. And this is a trend that we're seeing, especially in southern states, where states like Tennessee and Kentucky have also recently passed bills that expressly allow for intoxicating hemp beverages so long as they're sold in a manner that is similar to alcohol. And this is an interesting debate right now in the hemp world, as big alcohol has shown interest in distributing hemp beverages and participating in the profits of these products. And their argument is, well, we've been responsibly selling intoxicating beverages to adults for a long time now, and we think we can responsibly sell these hemp beverages to adults as well. And hemp's argument is, well, we appreciate the opportunity to be distributed in those channels, but maybe those shouldn't be the only channels that we can be sold in, and maybe we can responsibly sell to adults as well. And while this is a larger debate that's playing out at states across the country and including at the national level, at least we have some clarity in one state in Alabama this week. We'll know exactly what we can sell, where we can sell it, and how we can sell it starting January 1 of 2026. And for better or worse, there's clarity in at least one more state this week. Hemp policy never stops, so I will be back again for another report on Cannabis Coast to Coast News next week. Again, I'm Kerry Hinkle with Bayou City Hemp.
In Ohio, there is never a dull moment in the 24th state to legalize adult use sales of cannabis. Still, in its first year of sales, the legislature there continues to tweak their existing laws. Christina Brisson is our Ohio correspondent, and she has the story of that state now moving all intoxicating hemp products into licensed legal cannabis dispensaries. Here she is.
Hi, I'm Christina Brisson with Over the Top Renovations with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News. So the bills here in Ohio continue, and I'm going to have more information on that next week as we go over the different ones that are in play. However, recently, over 35 people testified in over 3 hours' time, testifying against HB 160, which is the most recent House bill, on top of another one that I'll tell you about next week. And as of April 26th, Ohio has reached $2.6 billion in sales between medical and non-medical sales. And the price of a gram has finally gone down to $6.45, whereas over almost a year ago it was at $10 per gram. I will have more information next week on the bills, and I look forward to bringing you more details into the political drama that's going on here in Ohio. I am Christina Brisson with your weekly Ohio Cannabis Report with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
With more and more pressure being felt by every part of the cannabis industry, the multi-state operators are adapting. With the market feeling the economic pressures to survive and keep the doors open, more and more multi-state operators are expanding their own footprint by making key acquisition during this distressed time. Terre Ascend has entered the Ohio market by acquiring a dispensary there. In its first quarter, investors call Trulieve believes that price comparison in many states will set up many more acquisitions, and they are looking to expand their already existing group of over 200 dispensaries. And a completely other story, the Cannabis is purging their portfolio of assets in Florida, Illinois, and California. While some are growing, others are contracting. Green Thumb Industries is sitting back and reports that they are not making any planned move or expansion and acquisition. With more on the publicly traded cannabis companies, here's our man, Doug Miller, who is high on Wall Street.
I'm Doug Miller from High on Wall Street with this week's Cannabis stock report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Curaleaf just dropped its Q1 2025 earnings, and while revenue cooled off a bit at $310 million, there's some serious green in the pipeline. International revenue hit $35 million, up a massive 74% year over year, marking their fourth straight quarter of 70% growth overseas. Domestically, revenue slowed 13% year over year, but Curaleaf is staying cash efficient with $42 million in operating cash flow, $26 million in free cash, and a healthy $122 million cash reserve. On the innovation side, Curaleaf rolled out new THC products like Select Formula X, a hemp-based energy drink, and Select Ace, a next-gen vape line, plus Anthem, a bold new pre-rolled brand. They have 151 retail locations and their first ever dedicated hemp store in Florida, but the company is managing a $54 million net loss this quarter. Let's see how the stock chart looks as Curaleaf's tightening operations, betting big on beverages, and staying high on the international expansions. It's trading around 84 cents, and it appears to be pulling back even more, so watch for dips and be sure to trade smart and lock in those profits. And that's this week's Cannabis Stock Report. Reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News, I'm Doug Miller.
Next up, a report on tribal lands who are getting into the cannabis space in their own sovereign governments. Here's Tina Tasaka with that story and more from Nevada.
I'm Tina Tasaka with 420 Technologies, and this is the Nevada and Tribal Nations Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. On May 6, Nevada's KNPR released State of Nevada's How is the Las Vegas Paiute Tribe Keeping Its Spot as a Cannabis Leader? In this enlightening interview, Benny Tassau, chairman of the Las Vegas Paiute Tribe, emphasized their cannabis enterprise, Nuwu Cannabis Marketplace, has significantly bolstered the tribe's ability to provide essential services such as medical care and water access. The revenue generated from their vertically integrated cannabis operations supports healthcare initiatives for both youth and elders, educational access, infrastructure development, and educational programs. By leveraging their sovereignty, the tribe has established higher cannabis regulations than the state. They want to set the gold standard, ensuring quality and safety while maximizing economic benefits for their community. This strategic approach not only enhances the well-being of their members, but also positions the tribe as a model for sustainable economic development within indigenous communities. The Las Vegas Paiute tribe is actively expanding its cannabis operations to include cultivation and production facilities. Wellness Orchards of Nevada has become the first cannabis company to receive the prestigious Safe Partner Award from Nevada's Safety, Consultation, and Training Section, SCATS. This honor is awarded to a maximum of 4 businesses annually, recognizing exceptional commitment to workplace safety. Margaret Taylor, Occupational Health and Safety Manager, praised SCATS support. When we called SCATS for a free safety consultation, we were impressed with the way they explained step by step what would occur during the consultation inspection prior to walking the facility with us. She added that the initial consultation led to further improvements across their sister sites, driven by SCATS experts' recommendations. That's it for the Nevada Highlights and Tribal Nations. I'm Tina Tasaka with 420 Technologies and Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
That'll do it for the B block, but when we come back, we continue with more reports from a variety of states, including California and Illinois. Cannabis Coast to Coast News continues after this.
What if we're right? What if all of a sudden they discovered that there is medical use for marijuana and that it is good for you and it's better than alcohol and it's better than opioids and it helps your health? What if we're right? What if they find that out?
Specific cannabinoids have medical value. These are facts.
I'm here today in hopes to assist in removing the demonized stigma of cannabis and the perception that cannabis is just about getting high. The true base of this plant has to be known.
I don't think anybody should ever go to jail for cannabis. It's a medicine, and everybody should have access to it.
This is something which, at the very, very least, is the key to alleviating suffering and extending life for millions of human beings. Right? For returning some kind of balance to our society, and quite possibly of restoring our planet's natural balance as well.
Welcome back to the C Block, or final section of this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Elena Pinto. Despite the challenges of 23 other adult use legal states, California remains king of the cannabis revenue market. Other states like Michigan may sell more types of cannabis-based products, but California revenue is twice as much as that state. Of course, rankings are easier to track when tied to tax revenue, and California collects more than twice as much as Michigan, Washington State, and Illinois. And now, with another tax hike lurking to go into effect on July 1st in that state, some MSOs are getting out of the California market, which has collected over $6 billion in tax revenue since its inception in 2018. You have to wonder how long that state can maintain its top spot with margins thin and getting thinner, with an increase in taxes again. With that in mind, we now have 2 correspondents who are involved with the cannabis industry in California. Here's Dina Naguib in the south and Yarrow Kubrin in the north.
I'm Dina Naguib, Principal Consultant at Grass Goddess Consulting, here to give you the latest developments in California for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. To kick us off, some good news out of Sacramento regarding AB 564, sponsored by Matt Haney, which passed another committee last week. The Revenue and Taxation Committee voted 6-0 to advance the bill, which blocks the excise tax increase from 15 to 19%. Amy Jenkins, Executive Director of the California Cannabis Operators Association, and Kristen Heidelbeck, Legislative Director of the United Food and Commercial Workers, testified in support of the bill along with a number of industry workers and advocates. Next up is the Appropriations Committee set to meet this week, so stay tuned. In other news, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, announced this week that the state has essentially eradicated hemp-derived THC products since the ban he instituted last year. Newsom stated that 99.7% of the businesses visited were in compliance with his ban. The cannabis industry responded with a variety of reactions, from thinking the announcement was comical to some more colorful comments about Newsom. The general consensus is that hemp-derived THC products are still rampant in California, just maybe not where the state was looking. In addition, the ban can only be extended for one more 90-day period, and it is unclear what will happen when that time is up. That's it for California. I'm Dina Naguib with Grass Goddess Consulting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
Yaro Kubrin here, Pro Cannabis Media, reporting on Northern California Week in Review. The California State Fair just wrapped up the submission window for cannabis entrance into the state fair. This is the first state fair in the history of the country to have cannabis awards. The state fair will be kicking off in the middle of July, a 17-day extravaganza, culminating in an award show for those cannabis entrants. If the Emerald Cup was the Oscar of cannabis awards, the California State Fair is Cannes. Looking forward to that. Last week, Sonoma Hills Farms, in association with Buddhist and Christina W., had the Pink Jesus Ice Cream Social. For those of you that don't know, Pink Jesus is a proprietary cultivar grown on Sonoma Hills Farms' West Petaluma estate. Don't worry, the strain is non-denominational. Lastly, we've got the shrinking ice caps with polar bears still trying to survive, and those cannabis operators are looking at a pending 26% increase to their state taxes from a whopping 15% to a lopping 19%. That was baked into the laws in 2022, thanks to Gavin Newsom. And yet, at the 11th hour, the cavalry coming over the hill, the Assembly Revenue and Taxation Committee just voted 6-0 to advance Bill 564, which would stop the excise tax from going up. Remember, that does not reduce the draconian taxes. It just stops them from going up further. Let's not forget, this country was based on tax revolt. We threw tea into the Boston Harbor. Let's hope we don't waste any cannabis throwing it into the Pacific Ocean.
Illinois continues to grow their revenue and subsequent tax dollars, but that state has other challenges. Mark Allen tells us that now cannabis businesses and politicians are working together in that state to curb licensing fees and taxes.
What's up, everybody? I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago Clone Guy, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Just outside of Chicago, Illinois, and this is Bird waving at you right now. Perfect timing. Lots always going on here in Illinois. First thing going on is that there's a bunch of cannabis business owners, craft growers, hemp growers that are teaming up with Representative Ford to pretty much get relief from burdensome and costly regulations. Specifically, they want reduced fees for licensing, reduced fees and taxes on products, reduce regulation in general. They want medical patients to be able to go to more than just one medical dispensary, to be able to go anywhere, open it up. So they're teaming up to make a lot of common sense decisions. Another thing interesting going on here in the state is that I found out that all the commercial craft growers that grow cannabis in the state have to conform to certain standards for their product. And one of those standards or tests is for pesticides. And I found out that 0, allegedly, craft growers or growers are capable of passing this test because the state accidentally made it impossible to pass. Literally, there was discrepancy. There was an accident. It was supposed to be a certain number that they had to meet or pass, but the state accidentally added a 0 to that number. So that accidental oops would make it literally impossible to pass this test. And also, if it's not only impossible to pass, but the people that actually perform the test said for them to actually perform the test on the product, which would have to be done every 2 months, would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to conform to that. So right now, the state is really quiet about this, and nobody really knows. But I think they need to go into that paperwork and that rule and delete a zero. Take a zero off, and then and then say you're sorry or just shut up and move on. But anyways, that's the Chicago way. I'm Mark Allen, the Chicago Clone Guy, reporting for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. This is Bird Waving again, checking out. Thanks for tuning in.
In Oklahoma, there will be a major change in the cannabis laws regarding the labeling and packaging of cannabis products starting June 1st. It's called pre-packaging, and Kimmy Cannabis explains what that's all about.
I am Kimmy Cannabis from Canna Talk About It with the Oklahoma Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Beginning June 1st, Oklahoma's cannabis rules are changing once again. Under the new regulation, all cannabis flower must be pre-packaged before reaching dispensary shelves, with package sizes ranging between 0.5 gram and 3 ounces. Cannabis purchased before June 1st can still be sold deli style, but once that inventory is gone, it's strictly pre-packaged from that point forward. So what does that compliant packaging look like? The law does permit non-opaque materials for medical cannabis flower as long as the package meets all other packaging requirements. And when it comes to packaging appeal, labels, packages, and containers must not attract children, meaning no toys, no cartoons, and no childlike imagery. Packaging should clearly display only the producer's name, logo, and an image of the product. Nothing more. For many growers, especially those who primarily dealt in bulk flower, this may be their first time navigating strict packaging compliance. And it does come with a cost. Ashley Nicole, compliance agent and sales rep for Grassfire Grow Co., explains. In an already bottom of the barrel market, this is going to put a lot of more grows out of business. They'll lose more money on packaging and labor. And if a grow uses a processor to pre-package their flower, it can't come back to the grow to be sold. That means cultivators now need a licensed distributor or processor just to get products to dispensaries. Who can afford to wait weeks to receive their money? That's it for the Oklahoma update. Peace, love, and all that good stuff.
Price compression continues in legal states all over the country. Perhaps the most glaring example is Michigan, where in 2019, a price for an ounce was $516. Now it's $65. Certainly good for consumers, but the market glut of product is a perfect example of supply and demand. One of the basic lessons in economics. Our Michigan reporter, Amy Carter, has an update on the Michigan cannabis market.
I'm Amy Carter with Michigan Weedsters, and it's time for this week's Michigan Report from Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Things are firing up in Michigan's cannabis scene, but not exactly for the right reasons. On April 24th, a bill was introduced that could allow law enforcement to conduct roadside swab tests for drug impairment. Buckle up, and here's what's brewing. A Kalamazoo company is claiming its shiny new testing method can sniff out impairment from a whole melody of substances. Think cannabis, opiates, cocaine, fentanyl, meth, prescription drugs, and more. It seems they can test for just about anything under the sun. If this proposal becomes law, Michigan would join the ranks to be the 25th state to embrace roadside saliva tests. Out of the previous 24, only Alabama and Indiana have permanent or active roadside screening programs for detecting substances in drivers. Minnesota is dipping its toes in the idea with a pilot program, but hasn't fully committed yet. With that being said, mark your calendars. Michigan Weedsters is hosting a lobby day on May 20th at 9 a.m. at the Anderson Building. Come join us to let your voice be heard. In other news, Indiana has rolled out a new law that puts the kibosh on cannabis advertising statewide. This includes billboards, mailers, digital ads, and even those mobile trucks zipping around. This is a bummer for Michigan dispensaries that have been counting on such ads to reel Indiana customers in. Now let's talk prices. Michigan's cannabis costs have taken a nosedive from a whopping $512 an ounce in 2019 to just around $65 today. Well, this sounds like a win for our wallets. It also means the market is getting a bit crowded with mediocre products, and that is for sure. And here is a juicy tidbit. Michigan regulators might soon gain the power to keep a close eye on cannabis businesses and their customers whenever they please. This could become a reality if one of the numerous proposed rule changes from the Cannabis Regulatory Agency gets the green light. Right now, businesses are required to record various operations, sales, processing, shipping, and keep it at least 30 days worth of footage on hand to share with the CRA investigators whenever they ask. But 24-hour active surveillance on customers and staff? Talk about keeping things on the lockdown. So, as I said, things are heating up here, and after sharing this week's news, I think I'm ready to go smoke. I'm Amy Carter with Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
We have a new correspondent we want to welcome from our native Massachusetts state. His name is Curtis Emery, and not only is he passionate about the cause, he's also a bud tender at Resonate, a Worcester dispensary. Here's Curtis's first report.
I'm Curtis Emery, a Massachusetts bud tender with the Bay State Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News. Massachusetts legislators are seeking to reevaluate existing laws. This week, hemp-derived products available outside of the dispensary environment. There are currently 4 bills this session which aim to empower local and state government to regulate the widely available products. The goal of such work? Keep hemp-derived products out of the hands of underage users and add some accountability to the statewide market. Calling all artists, the 36th annual Boston Freedom Rally is looking for their new official flyer. The organization is soliciting submissions from artists across the state wishing to take part. The Boston Freedom Rally will take place this year, September 19th and September 20th at the Boston Commons. Artists have until June 1st to submit their designs for the official flyer. There will be 2 votes, a People Choice Award, which will choose their favorite design on social media, and a Director's Choice, which will be voted on by a panel of judges from the Boston Freedom Rally itself. It seems like it'll be a great year to get involved. This has been Curtis Emery with the Bay State Cannabis Report for Cannabis Coast to Coast News.
And finally tonight, the celeb stoner Steve Bloom from New York shared a eulogy of sorts for the New York Cannabis Parade that was canceled for the first time in 53 years. There was a slim hope that a change in the parade route might have given the annual celebration of the plant medicine a second life. But this week, Steve explained in his weekly newsletter that the parade has been canceled. This is just another example of what happens when states legalize adult use of cannabis. The events that were held in protest of the draconian laws that created prohibition of cannabis end up going by the wayside. New York has a resilient group of businesses, and the culture is very strong in the Big Apple alone. And you have to think that this annual event will return sometime in the future. That's the hope anyway. And that's a wrap on this week's Cannabis Coast to Coast News. I'm Elena Pinto. Remember, it's a whole new world of weed out there. Consume it responsibly, and I'll see you again in June. PCM TV founder Jimmy Young anchors next week.
I think I messed up. Did you know there's a place that covers all the cannabis news you need? Welcome to Pro Cannabis Media, your go-to for all things cannabis. PCM is the CNBC of weed, bringing you the latest news and talk shows with a twist. We've got 16 state correspondents and multimedia journalists from around the US and Canada.
Hey everybody, it's Brandon Jones with Big Green Distribution with the Missouri Cannabis Report.
I'm Karen Black from Greenfinger Consulting with the Arizona Cannabis Report.
I'm Amy Carter from Michigan Weedsters.
Andrew Behringer here reporting from Washington, D.C.
It's Debbie Facey with the Canadian Toke of the Week.
It all started back in 2018 when founder Jimmy Young kicked off the In the Weeds podcast. His mission? Documenting the fight to end cannabis prohibition. Fast forward to today and we've got Cannabis Coast to Coast with Elena Pinto, delivering the nation's only TV-style cannabis news show.
Hi everyone, welcome to another edition of Cannabis Coast to Coast, PCM TV's weekly roundup of industry news from California to New York. I'm Elena Pinto.
As of August 2024, PCM has racked up over 1.2 million views and 14.5 million impressions on our YouTube channel. With 15,000 subscribers and growing, our reach is spreading like wildfire. PCM's website, YouTube, Rumble, Discord, Roku, Twitch, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, and even our very own PCM TV app. Get your cannabis news fix with Pro Cannabis Media. We're here to keep you informed and entertained. Stay tuned and stay lifted.